History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 2. The First Civilizations. Chapter 4. Intruders and Invaders. The Dark Ages of the Ancient Near East. The Near East in the Ages of Confusion. Confusion is a matter of perspective. For about 800 years from, say, the end of Knossos, the history of the Near East is indeed very confused, if our standpoint is that of world history. What was essentially going on were disputes about control of the slowly growing wealth of the best defined agricultural region of the ancient world. The empires which came and went could not find resources in the desert and steppe area on the borders of the Near East, which could justify their conquest, and in that story, it is hard to find any continuing thread. Invaders came and went rapidly, some of them leaving new communities behind them, some setting up new institutions to replace those they overthrew. This could hardly have been grasped by those to whom these events could only have come home occasionally and suddenly, when, for instance, their homes were burnt, their wives and daughters raped, their sons carried off to slavery, or less dramatically, when they discovered that a new governor was going to levy higher tax. Such events could be upsetting enough if a stronger word is not required. On the other hand, millions of people must also have lived out their lives unaware of any change more dramatic than the arrival in their village one day of the first iron sword or sickle. Hundreds of communities lived within a pattern of ideas and institutions unchanged for many generations. This is an important reservation. It must not be forgotten when we stress the dynamism and violence of Near East's history during the transition from the Bronze to Iron Ages, an era already considered from the standpoint of the peoples of the Aegean. On the mainland, wandering peoples moved about in a zone where there were long established centers of government and population, powerful and long lasting political structures, and numerous hierarchies of specialists in administration, religion, and learning. These partly explain why the coming of new peoples obliterates less of what had already been achieved than in the Aegean. Another conservative force was the contact many of the barbarians had already had with civilization in this region. It left them wanting not to destroy it but to enjoy its fruits themselves. These two forces helped in the long run to diffuse civilization further and to produce the increasing cosmopolitanism of a large and confused but civilized and interconnected Near East. The story begins very early, somewhere back towards the beginning of the second millennium BC, with the arrival in Asia Minor of the Hittites. Perhaps they belong to the same group of peoples as those of Minoan Crete. At any rate, they were established in Anatolia at about the same time that Minoan civilization was rising to its greatest triumphs. They were far from being primitive barbarians. They had a legal system of their own and absorbed much of what Babylon could teach. They had enjoyed a virtual monopoly of iron in Asia. This not only had great agricultural importance, but together with their mastery of fortification and the chariot, gave the Hittites a military superiority which was the scourge of Egypt and Mesopotamia. The raid which cut down Babylon in about 1590 BC was something like the high water mark of the first Hittite Empire. A period of eclipse and obscurity followed. Then, in the first half of the 14th century, came a renaissance of power. This second and even more splendid era saw a Hittite hegemony which stretched at one brief moment from the shores of the Mediterranean to the Gulf of Persia. It dominated all of the Fertile Crescent except Egypt and successfully challenged even the great military power while being almost ceaselessly at war with the Mycenaeans. But like other empires, it crumbled after a century or so, the end coming in about 1200 BC. The culmination and collapse of this great organizing effort at the beginning of the Dark Ages for Greece and the Aegean has two interesting features. The first is that the Hittites by this time no longer enjoyed a monopoly of iron. By about 1000 BC, it is to be found in use all over the Near East, and its diffusion must surely be part of the story of the swing of power against the Hittites. The other interesting feature is a coincidence with the rhythm of migrations. For it seems that the great diffusers of iron technology were the Indo European peoples, who, from about 1200 BC, were throwing so much into turmoil. The disappearance of Troy, which never recovered from the Achaean destruction, has been thought of great strategic importance in this respect. The city seems to have played, until this time, a leading role in an alliance of powers of Asia Minor, who had held the line against the barbarians from the north. After its overthrow, no other focus for resistance appeared. There is a closeness of timing which some have thought too pronounced to be merely coincidental between the collapse of the last Hittite power and the attacks of sea peoples recorded in the Egyptian records. The particular conquerors of the Hittites were a people from Thrace called the Phrygians. The Sea Peoples were yet another indicator of the great folk movement of the era. Armed with iron from the beginning of the 12th century BC, they were raiding the mainland of the East Mediterranean basin, ravaging Syrian and Levantine cities. Some of them may have been refugees from the Mycenaean cities who moved first to the Dodecanese and then to Cyprus. One group among them, the Philistines, settled in Canaan in about 1175 BC and are commemorated still by a modern name derived from their own, Palestine. But Egyptians were the major victims of the Sea Peoples. Like the Vikings of the northern seas, 2000 years later, sea born invaders and raiders plunged down on the delta again and again, undeterred by occasional defeat, at one time even wresting it from Pharaoh's control. Egypt was under great strain. In the early 11th century, she broke apart and was disputed between two kingdoms. Nor were the Sea Peoples Egypt's only enemies. At one point, a Libyan fleet appears to have raided the delta, though it was driven off. In the south, the Nubian frontier did not yet present a problem, but around 1000 BC, an independent kingdom emerged in the Sudan, which would later be troublesome. The tidal surge of barbarian peoples was wearing away the old structures of the Near East, just as it had worn away Mycenaean Greece. This is far enough into the welter of the events to make it clear that we have entered an age both too complex and too obscure for straightforward narration. Mercifully, there soon appear two threads through the turmoil. One is an old theme renewed, that of the continuing Mesopotamian tradition about to enter its last phase. The other is quite new. It begins with an event we cannot date and know only through tradition recorded centuries later, but which probably occurred during the testing times imposed on Egypt by the Sea Peoples. Whenever and however it happened, a turning point has been reached in world history when there went out of Egypt people whom the Egyptian called Hebrews and the world later called Jews. For many people over many centuries, mankind's history before the coming of Christianity was the history of the Jews and what they recounted of the history of others. Both were written down in the books called the Old Testament, the sacred writings of the Jewish people, subsequently diffused worldwide in many languages by the Christian missionary impulse and the invention of printing. They were to be the first people to arrive at an abstract notion of God and to forbid his representation by images. No people has produced a greater historical impact from such comparatively insignificant origins and resources. Origins so insignificant indeed that it is still difficult to be sure of very much about them. The origins lie among the Semitic nomadic peoples of Arabia, whose prehistoric and historic tendency was to press into the richer lands of the Fertile Crescent nearest to their original homes. The first stage of their story, of which history must take notice, is the age of the patriarchs, whose traditions are embodied in the biblical accounts of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There do not seem to be good grounds for denying that men who were the origins of these gigantic and legendary figures actually existed. If they did, it was in about 1800 BC, and their story is a part of the confusion following the end of Ur. The Bible states that Abraham came from Ur to Canaan. This is quite plausible and would not conflict with what we know of the dispersal of Amorite and other tribes in the next 400 years. Those among them who were to be remembered as the descendants of Abraham became known in the end as Hebrews, a word meaning wanderer, which does not appear before Egyptian writings and inscriptions of the 14th or 13th century BC, long after their first settlement in Canaan. Although this word is not wholly satisfactory, it is probably the best name to give the tribes which were concerned at this time. It is a better term to identify this group than Jews, and for all the traditional associations gathered around that word by centuries of popular usage, it is best to reserve it, as scholars usually do, for a much later era than that of the patriarchs. It is in Canaan that Abraham's people are first distinguishable in the Bible. They are depicted as pastoralists, organized tribally, quarreling with neighbors and kinsmen over wells and grazing, still liable to be pushed about the Near East by the pressures of drought and hunger. One group among them went down into Egypt, we are told perhaps in the early 17th century BC. It was to appear in the Bible as the family of Jacob. As the story unfolds in the Old Testament, we learn of Joseph, the great son of Jacob, rising high in Pharaoh's service. At this point, we might hope for the help from Egyptian records. It has been suggested that this happened during the Hyksos ascendancy, since only a period of large scale disturbance could explain the improbable preeminence of a foreigner into the Egyptian bureaucracy. It may be so, but there is no evidence to confirm or disprove it. There is only tradition, as there is only tradition for all Hebrew history until about 1200 BC. This tradition is embodied in the Old Testament. Its texts only took their present form in the 7th century BC, perhaps 800 years after the story of Joseph, though older elements can be and have been distinguished in them. As evidence, it stands in something like the relation to Jewish origins in which Homer stands to those of Greece. None of this would matter very much, and certainly would not interest anyone except professional scholars were it not for events which occurred from 1 to 3,000 years later. Then the destinies of the whole world were swayed by the Christian and Islamic civilizations, whose roots lay in the religious tradition of a tiny, not very easily identifiable Semitic people, for centuries hardly distinguishable from many similar wanderers by the rulers of the great empires of Mesopotamia and Egypt. This was because the Hebrews somehow arrived at a unique religious vision. Throughout the world of the ancient Near East, it is possible to see at work forces which were likely to make monotheistic religious views more appealing. The power of local deities was likely to be questioned after contemplation of the great upheavals and disasters which time and time again swept across the region after the First Babylonian Empire. The religious innovations of Akhenaten and the growing assertiveness of the cult of Marduk have both been seen as responses to such a challenge. Yet only the Hebrews and those who came to share their beliefs were able to push the process home, transcending polytheism and localism to arrive at a coherent and uncompromising monotheism. The timing of this process is very difficult to establish, but its essential steps were not complete before the 8th century BC. In the earliest times at which Hebrew religion could be distinguished, it was probably polytheistic, but also monolatrous. That is to say, that like other Semitic peoples, the tribes who were the forerunners of the Jews believed that there were many gods but worshipped only one, their own. The first stage of refinement was the idea that the people of Israel, as the descendants of Jacob came to be known, owed exclusive allegiance to Yahweh, the tribal deity, a jealous God who made a covenant with his people to bring them again to the promised land, the Canaan, to which Yahweh had already brought Abraham out of Ur, and which remains a focus of racial passion right down to the present day. The covenant was a master idea. Israel was assured that if it did something, then something desirable would follow. This was very unlike the religious atmosphere of Mesopotamia or Egypt. The exclusive demands of Yahweh opened the way to monotheism. For when the time came for this, the Israelites felt no respect for other gods, which might be an obstacle for such evolution. Nor was this all. At an early date, Yahweh's nature was already different from that of other tribal gods. That no graven image was to be made of him was the most important distinctive feature of his cult. At times, he appears as other gods in an eminent dwelling place, such as a temple made with hands, or even in manifestations of nature. But as the Israelite religion developed, he could be seen as transcendent deity. The Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. Psalm 9 4 says a psalm. He had created everything but existed independently of his creation, a universal being. Whither shall I go from thy spirit, or whither shall I flee from thy presence? Asked the psalmist. Psalm 7. The creative power of Yahweh was something else, differentiating the Jewish from the Mesopotamian tradition. Both saw man's origin in a watery chaos. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, says the book of Genesis. For the Mesopotamian, no pure creation was involved. Somehow, matter of some sort had always been there, and the gods only arranged it. It was different for the Hebrews. Yahweh had already created the chaos himself. He was for Israel what was later described in Christian creed, maker of all things, by whom all things are made. Moreover, he made man in his own image, as a companion, not as a slave. Man was the culmination and supreme revelation of his creative power, a creature able to know good from evil, as did Yahweh himself. Finally, man moved in a moral world set by Yahweh's own nature. Only he was just. Man made laws might or might not reflect his will, but he was the sole author of right and justice. The implications of such ideas were to take centuries to clarify and millennia to demonstrate their full weight. At first, they were well wrapped up in the assumptions of a tribal society looking for a god's favor in war. Much in them reflected the special experience of a desert dwelling people. Later, Jewish tradition placed several great emphasis on its origin in the Exodus from Egypt, a story dominated by the gigantic and mysterious figure of Moses. Clearly, when the Hebrews came to Canaan, they were already consciously a people grouped around the cult of Yahweh. The biblical account of the wanderings in Sinai probably reports the crucial time when this national consciousness was forged. But the biblical tradition is again all that there is to depend upon, and it was only recorded much later. It is certainly credible that the Hebrews should at last have fled from harsh oppression in a foreign land, an oppression which could, for example, reflect burdens imposed by the mobilizing of labor for huge building operations. Moses is an Egyptian name, and there may well have existed a historical origin of the great legendary leader who dominates the biblical story by managing the Exodus and holding the Hebrews together in the wilderness. In the traditional account, he founded the law by bringing down the Ten Commandments from his encounter with Yahweh. This was the occasion of the renewal of the covenant by Yahweh and his people at the Mount Sinai, and it may be seen as a formal return to its tradition by a nomadic people whose cult had been eroded by long sojourn in the Nile Delta. Unfortunately, the exact role of the great religious reformer and national leader remains impossible to define, and the commandments themselves cannot be convincingly dated until much later than the time when he lived. Yet, though the biblical account cannot be accepted as it stands, it should be treated with respect as our only evidence for much of Jewish history. It contains much that can be related to what is known or inferred from other sources. Archaeology comes into the historian's help only with the arrival of the Hebrews in Canaan. The story of the conquest told in the book of Joshua fits evidence of destruction in Canaanite cities in the 13th century BC. What we know of Canaanite culture and religion also fits the Bible's account of Hebrew struggles against local cult practice and a pervasive polytheism. Palestine was disputed between two religious traditions and two peoples throughout the 12th century, and this, of course, again illustrates the collapse of Egyptian power. Since then, this crucial area could not have been left to the prey of minor Semitic peoples had the monarchy's power still been effective. It now seems likely that the Hebrews attracted to their support other nomadic tribes, and touchstone of alliance being adherence to Yahweh. After settlement, although the tribes quarreled with one another, they continued to worship Yahweh, and this was, for some time, the only uniting force among them. For tribal divisions formed Israel's only political institution. The Hebrews took as well as destroyed. They were clearly, in many ways, less advanced culturally than the Canaanites, and they took over their script. They borrowed their building practice too, though without always achieving the same level of town life as their predecessors. Jerusalem was for a long time a little place of filth and confusion, not within striking distance of the level reached by the town life of the Minoans long before. Yet in Israel lay the seeds of much of the future history of human race. Settlement in Palestine has been essentially a military operation, and military necessity provoked the next stage in the consolidation of a nation. It seems to have been the challenge from the Philistines, who were obviously more formidable opponents than the Canaanites, which stimulated the emergence of the Hebrew kingship at some time about 1000 BC. With it appears another institution, that of the special distinction of the prophets. For it was a prophet Samuel who anointed and thus in effect designated both Saul, the first king, and his successor David. When Saul reigned, the Bible tells us Israel had no iron weapons, for the Philistines took care not to endanger their supremacy by permitting them. Nonetheless, the Jews learned the management of iron from their enemies. The Hebrew words for knife and helmet both have Philistine roots. Plowshares did not exist, but if they had, they could have been beaten into swords. Saul won victories but died at last by his own hand, and his work was completed by David. Of all Old Testament individuals, David is outstandingly credible both for his strengths and weaknesses. Although there is no archaeological evidence that he existed, he lives still as one of the greatest figures of world literature and was a model for kings for 2000 years. The literary account, confused though it is irresistibly convincing. It tells of a noble hearted and flawed and all too human hero who ended the Philistine peril and reunited the kingdom, which had split at Saul's death. Jerusalem became Israel's capital, and David then imposed himself upon the neighboring peoples. Among them were the Phoenicians, who had helped him against the Philistines, and this was the end of Tyre as an important independent state. Yet it was David's son and successor, Solomon, who was the first king of Israel to achieve major international standing. He gave his army a chariot arm, launched expeditions to the south against the Edomites, allied with Phoenicia, and built a navy. Conquest and prosperity followed. And Solomon reigned over all kingdoms from the river Euphrates unto the land of the Philistines, and unto the border of Egypt. And Judah and Israel dwelt safely, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, from Dan even to Beersheba, all the days of Solomon. Kings chapter 4, lines 21 to 25. Again, this sounds like the exploitation of possibilities available to the weak when the great are in decline. The success of Israel under Solomon is further evidence of the eclipse of the older empires, and it was matched by the successes of other now forgotten peoples of Syria and the Levant, who constituted the political world depicted in the obscure struggles recorded in the Old Testaments. Most of them were descendants of the old Amorite expansion. Solomon was a king of great energy and drive, and the economic and technical advances of this period were also notable. He was an entrepreneur, ruler of the first rank. The legendary King Solomon's mines have been said to reflect the activity of the first copper refinery, of which there is evidence in the Near East, but this is disputed. Certainly, the building of the temple after Phoenician models was only one of the many public works, though perhaps the most important. David had given Israel a capital, thus increasing the tendency to political centralization. He had planned a temple, and when Solomon built it, the worship of Yahweh was given a more splendid form than ever before and an enduring focus.